So everyone needs to behave. Okay.
Are you
And,
going to mute us, Sandy? I
I
mean,
think,
Sue, are you
yeah.
going to mute us?
I suggest everybody mute yourselves, but if you're
Okay.
recalcitrant and you don't, I will mute you. So I'm giving you the opportunity for independent action. And if you're not able to do that, I will intervene. How about that?
And I'm going to start screen sharing now. Is that okay, Sue?
Perfect.
Can you all see the PowerPoint, I guess? Okay. Well, let me start off by going back and restating perhaps some of the reasons why doing this program. And it occurred to me that this is sort of a modest metaphor, but you'll see the first item on there, fratricide. In one sense, this war between Ukraine and Russia is a fratricide. They are, in a real sort of metaphorical sense, brothers. But it reminded me of a fight that I had with my brothers when I was a teenager. One of my brothers. And when I thought about that fight, I thought it had some relevance to what we're doing here. My family had been on a vacation, a road trip. We were in one of these big mobile motor homes that you drove around in. We'd been in that thing for like 2 weeks, and things were getting pretty testy between my brothers and I, a bunch of teenage boys. And one day we were on a beach, and I was laying on the beach. My brother was up on a ridge above the beach, and suddenly I heard this thump, and I saw this rock come down and land about 4 or 5 feet away from my head. And I looked up, I saw my brother up on the ridge, and I thought, my brother just threw a rock at me. Could have killed me. And he came down, he told me he didn't throw that rock. It must have been somebody else, or if it was he that caused it, it must have rolled down the hill or whatever. And we started to get into it, yelling at each other and getting close to each other. And I think at one point he sort of pushes me, and I turn around. This is the first time, the only time I've ever done this. He's bigger than I am. And I punched him. And at the point where I punched him, my father had just come around the corner. And all my father saw was me punch my brother. And my father ran over and grabbed me and threw me down on the beach. And the reason I tell that story is because, in a way, I think that the American public's view of what's happened in Ukraine is like my father coming across me and seeing me punch my brother, but not knowing any of the history. And none of the history in the case of that little incident would have justified me punching my brother. And none of the history that we're about to go through would justify this invasion. But what it may do is inform us in some way, as it might have informed my father, who might have thought, from just seeing me hit my brother with apparently no explanation, that I was some sort of sociopath or incurably violent person that might need to be expelled from the family, to rather make it him more able to reconcile my brother and I, and to reconcile my father with me. And I think we are, and that is, to me, part of the purpose of what we're doing here. The other thing that occurred to me is, I remember a number of weeks ago, Greg gave what I thought was an excellent sermon on the conundrum between turning the other cheek and standing up for justice. How do you reconcile those two things? And it occurred to me that, at a minimum, what turning the other cheek should mean is that we turn our heads so that we can hear what the other party, what our enemy is saying. If not only for our own good, but for everyone's good. Now, when I go through this history, I want you to know that I don't bring out what I'm going to bring out because I necessarily, in fact, in most cases, don't agree with the Russian view of things. But I bring it out if I think it's true in two ways. One, that it's actually a fact that happened. It's actually an event that occurred. And two, to the extent that it articulates Russian point of view, that I believe it is, for the most part, a sincerely held view on their part. Not always. Sometimes it's for bluff. Sometimes it's for propaganda. Sometimes it's for internal or external political gain. The same, I would say, is true of us. But I think, for the most part, that what they are saying are things that they genuinely believe, no matter how inaccurate I think they are. I guess two other things I wanted to say. If any of you got what I'm now referring to as my long email on this question of the change in U.S. policy objectives, is I listened to a program sponsored by the Brookings Institute this morning. 7 different experts in various areas of international affairs discussing U.S. strategic plans, including this change in U.S. foreign policy. And almost all of them thought that the change in foreign policy was a mistake. Most of them were quite measured in their criticism, saying that they thought it was risky or ill-advised. The program on the NewsHour today, Mersheimer was much more strong in his criticism of it. And I should say this about Mersheimer. John Mersheimer has been sort of a dissenting voice in American foreign policy for, I'm going to say 50 years. He opposed the Vietnam War. He opposed the Iraq War. He believes our policy in the Middle East has been too tilted towards Israel. And he's opposed our policy towards Russia. At least with respect to the Vietnam War and the Iraq War, he turned out to be right. With respect to the policy on Russia, he has been warning us for almost 20 years that the expansion of NATO and our policy was putting us needlessly in a potential crash course with Russia, and I think he's turned out to be right about that. Whether you think the crash is worth it or not is a different matter. But for me, he's got a lot of credibility. So with that, let me turn to, and now I can't seem to get my, there we go. Recap from last week. 3 things. We talked about the clash of civilizations. As Samuel Huntington wrote in that, what I will tell you is a controversial book that a lot of people disagree with. The clash of civilizations, Huntington said that the line between civilizations, that the line between civilizations is going to replace the Iron Curtain as the line of conflict, and that line between Western civilization and Russian civilization, the line between Catholicism, Western Christianity, and Orthodox Christianity runs through the Ukraine. And that line running through the Ukraine has significance with respect to, at a minimum, the political divide that existed in Ukraine before the war. Now, that political divide has been, that political divide was largely a divide between those who thought it more important to look to the West and those who thought it more important to look to Russia. I don't think there was ever a political divide as between those who wanted to be part of Russia and those who wanted to be an independent nation. That was not what the divide was about. The divide was basically who should we be looking to for our most important relationships. The other thing about the clash of civilizations, and I think this is important because I think the failure to recognize this is part of the problem, where I think we have made Russia a greater threat to us and Western Europe than it actually is. I think the Russian civilization collapsed in 1991. But for the fact that that civilization and Russia still have nuclear weapons, strategic and tactical, I think we would largely consider Russia to be what Barack Obama described it as: a regional superpower, a regional power with border disputes with its neighbors, not as a threat to the world. The Western civilization, on the other hand, in 1991 was not only the predominant, but the unipolar civilization. We were the greatest power on earth by some multiple. And it was our policy, articulated expressly by the State Department, that we should maintain military superiority so great that the combination of all the rest of the nations in the world couldn't defeat us. That articulated policy, of course, engendered some concerns from many of all the rest of the nations in the world. What's happened since then is that China has risen, and we are now in a multipolar world. And according to everyone that I've heard talk on this subject, believes that the rise of China is a greater, quote, threat to Western civilization than Russia could ever be, and that driving Russia into the arms, and this is Mersheimer now, that driving Russia into the arms of China, as we are doing, is a grave mistake from our own strategic point of view. And let me turn to World War I again. That war, to me, is the greatest mistake in world history, because the mistakes that led us into World War I also led us. They weren't the same mistakes when we went into World War II, but World War II was a continuation of World War I. And we sleptwalked into that war. It was characterized by a series of crises before the summer of 1914 between the nations that ended up fighting that war. Those crises had the almost contradictory effects of both increasing the anger of each side. At the end of each of those crises, each side came out of the crisis believing that they had been taken advantage of, that the other side was more and more evil or hurtful or threatening. But it also created the sense, when the crises arose, because they had been resolved, that when the crisis arose in the summer of 1914, notwithstanding the escalation of rhetoric and anger on all sides, resulting from the prior 10 years of conflict, that somehow or another, the great powers would avoid a war because they always had in the past. The other thing that led to World War I was that at each step in the way, each of the great powers took actions that narrowed and eliminated their options. They took actions that narrowed and eliminated their options, both from a diplomatic point of view and a military point of view. For instance, the mobilization of troops started to limit the options that were available, both to the party mobilizing and the other parties. But the other thing that happened was that there was an escalation of the rhetoric by each side against the other, an escalation of the rhetoric of the threat that each side posed to the other, an escalation of the evil that each side posed to the other. And even in another echo or another occurrence that we hear the echoes of today, when Germany at the beginning of World War I invaded Belgium on their way to France, the Germans had expected that the Belgians would basically just let them go through and not fight. They were surprised. The Belgians actually put up a considerable resistance against the German forces, including firing on them as they marched through towns or went through towns from buildings and villages. And the German army reacted with an undisciplined, for the Germans especially, anger, and engaged in war crimes, killing civilians, sometimes intentionally, sometimes because they just didn't know who was a combatant and who wasn't. And that conduct by the Germans through Belgium radicalized England with respect to the war and their vision of Germany as the evil Hun. And I think we're seeing the same phenomenon occur here. And by saying that, I don't mean to suggest or excuse the war crimes that have been committed. I simply mean to say that wars take on a momentum of their own. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, just like World War I, evidenced the process of escalation and the logic of escalation, that at each step in the way, each side believes, usually mistakenly, that if we just put a little more pressure on the other side, if we just bring a little more pressure to bear, they'll give up. I mean, the most perfect and dysfunctional example of that was in Vietnam, the Vietnam War itself, where we now know from General McMaster's book, based on declassified documents from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that Lyndon Johnson was told in 1964 and 65 that the war could not be won. And he pursued a policy believing that if we did a graduated escalation of our policy, graduated escalation of the military force we brought to bear, that eventually the North Vietnamese would capitulate, even though Johnson knew that we couldn't win the war. That process of escalation, Kennedy was asked, how do we stop that in the Cuban Missile Crisis? And after being told by the Joint Chiefs that the escalation could result in a nuclear war, in fact, the odds he was given was that there was something between a 25 and 50% chance that the crisis would end up in a thermonuclear exchange, that somewhere along the line, hopefully cooler heads would prevail. But that's hard to do when you're in that dynamic. And it's hard to do when you're angry. And it's hard to do when you're motivated by what you perceive to be a self-righteous anger. The other thing the Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated is that when we talk about the nuclear risk in this situation, one of the things that, for example, this Professor Farkas said on the news tonight is, yes, there is a risk, but for Vladimir Putin to use tactical nuclear weapons would not be a rational choice. Well, of course, as Mersheimer pointed out, it may be a rational choice if he believes that the existence of his nation, or at least even of his own rule, is at threat. But what the Cuban Missile Crisis evidenced is that the risk, the perhaps even bigger nuclear risk, is from an accident. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was one instance where someone actually advocated for a thermonuclear war. That was Castro urging Khrushchev to launch to be willing to have a thermonuclear war to defeat the United States with respect to the missile crisis. But there were two accidents that nearly caused a nuclear exchange by mistake. So the nuclear risk is not simply a risk that someone will make an irrational choice. The nuclear risk is that a mistake will be made, that some commander, and that's what occurred in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 2 occasions, lower level commanders launched or were about to launch military action contrary to the orders of their superiors and the ultimate governmental authority, contrary to the Soviet orders, and those events, had they played out as people thought they would play out, would have led to a nuclear exchange. And then the last thing is the political constraints on avoiding Armageddon. Remember this, President Kennedy had been told that there was a 25 to 50% chance that there might be a thermonuclear war, and that there was a deal on the table that would end the crisis, and the deal would involve us removing our missiles from Russia's border or Soviet border in Turkey, missiles we were going to remove anyway, in return for the Soviets removing missiles from Cuba, and for the United States committing never again to invade or to underwrite an invasion of Cuba as had been done in the Bay of Pigs. And what we didn't know at that time, and what came out when all of the CIA's records with respect to this situation and the Kennedy assassination were, well, I don't know that all of them have not been declassified, but we now know from the declassified records that the Kennedy administration and the CIA were in an active plan to assassinate Castro in conjunction with organized crime operatives who were anxious to basically get their businesses back in gambling and sex and drugs in Cuba that had existed before Castro took power. In fact, on the very day Kennedy was assassinated, there were CIA agents in Havana trying to poison Castro. Now, notwithstanding all of that, we had a deal, we had an essentially costless deal on the table that would end the Cuban Missile Crisis. And yet Kennedy felt that he could not, for political reasons, publicly agree to the deal. He told the Soviets, I will privately tell you I will move those missiles out of Turkey, but you can't make that commitment public. If you do, I won't do it. And the Russians and Khrushchev accepted that private assurance, and they removed their missiles based solely on our assurance that we wouldn't invade Cuba again. That demonstrates the political constraints, or better, maybe more differently said, the risks that leaders are prepared to take, even with respect to nuclear risks, for political reasons.
It's 7:30.
So now let me go back to the start of all this. Actually, just to remind you that the sequence of events when the Soviet Union collapsed was first the Warsaw Pact came apart. In 1989, and for the post-war period after World War II, a balance of power existed on the European continent, essentially between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. In 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Warsaw Pact unraveled, but it unraveled because Gorbachev allowed it to unravel. He denounced what was then called the Brezhnev Doctrine, which is a doctrine that the Soviet Union was entitled to intervene into the internal affairs of any of the other nations in Eastern Europe if the Soviet Union perceived that the developments in that nation represented a threat to the viability of international communism, which of course really meant a threat to the Soviet Union. Of course, Putin was in Dresden in Germany when the wall fell, and when riots occurred in East Germany. And the very core of the problem we still have came to fore at that right then and there, because there was a difference between Gorbachev's vision of what the new world order that he thought he was co-partnering with the United States would be, and our vision of what it would be. Gorbachev's vision was that the nations of Europe, as he put it, from Vancouver to Vladivostok, that is the Western Soviet, Vladivostok, I think is how you pronounce it, that those that cross that great span of nations would come together and create a new security structure, something like a United Nations maybe, but that the Soviet Union, and at this point there still was a Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union would be a part of it, that the Soviet Union would be respected within it, and that the Soviet Union would be treated sort of on parity with the United States within that security structure. The United States had a different vision of what the post-war world would look like. The United States vision was that the collapse of the Soviet Union was evidence that democracy and free markets had prevailed all around the world, that it was inevitable that all of the world would be converted to democracies and free markets. That vision would prevail, it was inevitable, and that was better, and I do agree with this, if that happened, it's better for the world, and it would be better for the United States in terms of maintaining peace. But the key difference there was that Gorbachev's vision was that we don't try to change the internal politics of other nations, that the Soviet Union, even if it retained communism or whatever political system it had, would be respected and treated with parity. The US vision was Russia's going to change. And indeed, for the 1990s, we attempted to cause that change to occur. Now, when the Soviet Union actually started to come apart, after the Warsaw Pact had collapsed, and all of these nations previously under the domination of the Soviet Union became free of that domination, then the Soviet Union itself started to come apart. And of course, the biggest part of the Soviet Union was the Russian Federation, but the second biggest part of the Soviet Union was the Ukrainian Federation. And the Russians, for political reasons, were willing to let the Ukraine go. I mean, it's a little complicated story, but Yeltsin wanted to get rid of Gorbachev. And the one way Yeltsin thought of getting rid of Gorbachev was to get rid of the Soviet Union. And that Yeltsin would lead the Russian Federation, the Soviet Union would be gone, and Gorbachev would be gone. And so Yeltsin was prepared, and the Russians were prepared to allow the federations within the Soviet Union to become, quote, independent states, but within a commonwealth of independent states. And even Yeltsin, all through the 1990s, articulated repeatedly that it was a vital part of Russian foreign policy, even after this dissolution, that there would some degree of central control or central coordination with respect to military and economic affairs would continue. The level of integration in military and economic affairs was not defined in the structure of the Commonwealth of Independent States, but 3 Slavic states became part of the Commonwealth, somewhat differing terms for each of them. I misspelled Belarus here, but Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus were the 3 Slavic federations in the Soviet Union that became part of the Commonwealth of Independent States. There were 5 Central Asian states, and then there was Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Moldova also. Now, what were the problems when this dissolution occurred? And these are problems that existed from day one, and they have continued until this day. The first was, what's the level of economic integration? At the time the dissolution occurred, of course, Ukraine's economy was completely integrated in the Soviet economy and completely integrated with the Russian economy. And when the dissolution of the Soviet Union occurred, there was literally no plan as to how that dissolution and the existing economic integration would either be maintained, changed, or ended. And compare that to the problems England is having and the EU are having in negotiating the terms and effectuating Brexit. They've been at that. They've been trying to negotiate the terms of Brexit for, I guess, probably at least 8 years now, or if not more. Thought they had reached an agreement. Now Britain is saying, well, wait a minute, this agreement doesn't work for us anymore, particularly in Northern Ireland. But after 8 years of negotiating between partners and former partners, at least in good faith, they still haven't come to any resolution of what form of integration, if any, should continue between the UK and the EU. In the case of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was no plan. Nothing existed. So that was the first problem. Another problem was the military problem. And the military problem took two shapes. One was the Soviet Union, of course, had control over nuclear assets. Many of those nuclear assets were in Ukraine. Who's going to control the nuclear assets after this dissolution occurs? Are they going to become Ukrainian arms? Are they going to remain Soviet or Russian arms, or Russia as the successor to the Soviet Union? What's going to happen with the nuclear weapons? Of course, the United States was also very concerned about that. As I mentioned last week, when George Bush argued went to Ukraine, went to Kiev in 1989 and gave a speech to the parliament encouraging them not to leave the Soviet Union, one of his biggest concerns was what's going to happen to the nuclear weapons if you guys come apart. The other major military issue was the Black Sea Fleet, the Soviet port for that fleet in Sevastopol, and Crimea. Crimea had been made part of the Ukraine by Khrushchev in 1954. Crimea actually has a different cultural and ethnic history than the Ukraine does. And in fact, when the Ukraine withdrew out of the Soviet Union, there was a movement in Crimea to have Crimea secede from the Ukraine. What's going to happen to the fleet? What's going to happen to the port? And how important is that fleet and that port to Russia? Well, for probably 1,000 years in Russian history, the single most important aspect of their strategic interest was having a warm water port that would have access to the Mediterranean. Because back in the days before climate change, all the ports in the north were frozen over in the winter. So it was the Russians, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, have always considered the maintenance of access to the Mediterranean through the Black Sea to be probably one of the single most vital interests that country has. And the Black Sea Fleet and the port at Sevastopol were the embodiment of that interest. What's going to happen to those? Now those issues, the nuclear issue and the Black Sea issue, the nuclear issue was resolved in 1994 by the trilateral agreement, which the United States put a lot of pressure on Ukraine to agree to give the nuclear weapons that they had back to Russia. We wanted that to happen. We did not want the proliferation that would result from those weapons being in the hands of Ukrainians. We gave some level of security assurances, both we and the Russians, to the Ukrainians in return for surrendering those weapons, which is why Zelensky sometimes will be saying now we should have kept the weapons because nobody honored the security assurances they gave us, and now we don't have the weapons. If we'd had the weapons, Russia wouldn't have invaded us. On the Black Sea fleet, what ultimately happened in 1997 is an echo of the Guantanamo Bay situation for the United States, where we entered into a long-term lease with Cuba to lease the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba for, I forget how long that lease goes, maybe 100 years, maybe 200. It's a long lease. The Russians entered into a similar lease with the Ukraine. And that lease has been extended. It currently goes, I think, to was supposed to go until 2045. But during the Maidan Uprising in 2014, which I hope to get to, there was threats from the Ukrainian side to terminate the lease. There were also threats when Ukraine talks about entering into NATO or the EU, that port and that fleet being within a nation that's part of the EU and part of NATO more presents problems for the Russians. Boy, oh boy. Another one of the great divides, as I mentioned before, is what is going to replace the balance of power structure that existed when the Warsaw Pact dissolved. And there were a number of things that were discussed in the 1990s. One actually was the dissolution of NATO. And in fact, within the NATO bureaucracy, a point of view developed that if NATO didn't change its objectives and its purposes and take on broader objectives than those that existed when the Soviet Union still existed, NATO would die because it would serve no purpose. The other was to create trans-European security organizations that Russia would participate in. And the one that was created, and a number were, and they've never really ever worked out, but the one that currently exists is what's now called the Organization on Security and Cooperation. And before this crisis broke out, the Russians and the Europeans, in the context of that organization, met and tried to work out their differences, but were unsuccessful. Now, the biggest controversy between the United States and the Soviet Union and Ukraine has to do with NATO. And one of the controversies is, at this time when the Soviet Union came apart, Putin claims, we promised him that NATO wouldn't expand. We didn't promise him, we promised Yeltsin or Russia that NATO wouldn't expand east of Germany. And in fact, in a conversation that I read to you last week, not 1 inch further. We say that statement that was made that NATO wouldn't expand not 1 inch further was a hypothetical that was posed by James Baker to Gorbachev, not a commitment. And the book that I've been reading, I think, has a pretty even-handed discussion of what happened then. And here's what the book says about the genesis of the NATO controversy. First, Soviet leaders strongly objected to a reunified Germany becoming a NATO member. When Gorbachev finally acquiesced in Germany, the unified Germany becoming a NATO member, it was not necessarily because he agreed to it, but because he couldn't stop it. Second, various verbal assurances were given to Soviet leaders, but they focused on East Germany and were vague. Third, no written commitment was made about anything other than East Germany. That's why at the beginning of this crisis, Putin said, I want it in writing that you won't expand NATO, because we have been telling the Russians for 20 years, well, what we said to you verbally about not expanding NATO, first of all, it was hypothetical, it wasn't a promise. And second of all, you never got it in writing, and we've had subsequent agreements where you've acknowledged the expansion of NATO, or at least acquiesced in it. Third, and this is the last point, Russian leaders, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, believed that in spirit, a commitment was made that NATO would not expand eastward. Some Western analysts agree that commitment was given in spirit. Therefore, Russia felt later that the spirit of the agreement to allow German reunification, which is what we got supposedly in return for our agreement not to allow NATO to expand eastward, was a violation of the spirit of what was communicated to the Soviet Union at the time. Mikhail Gorbachev, who won a Nobel Peace Prize and is pretty well respected in the West, gave a speech on this issue in 2014. I won't read the whole part of it, but he concluded with the statement, the decision for the US and its allies to expand NATO into the East, a decision decisively made in 1993, was definitely a violation of the spirit of the statements and assurances made to us in 1990. Now that's Gorbachev, that's not Putin. Now, oh boy, what has divided Russia and the West from 1991 until now? All of these things have been in operation at various levels of intensity for the past 20 years, and they are at an acute point right now. First of all, I want to talk about something called the security paradox. This is a doctrine of international relations that's pretty well accepted. It has three parts to it. Part number one is that the nations of the world live in an anarchic or in a state of anarchy. There is no world government. There is no world court. There is no world authority that can adjudicate and resolve disputes between nations and protect one nation from another. You're on your own. What that means is that every nation has an understandable impulse to do whatever it can to promote its own security. Here's the paradox. Every act that nation A takes to promote its own security causes a reaction from other nations that view that act of increasing the security of nation A as decreasing their security and causing them to take an act that they believe will now enhance their security in response to the first act. And then the first actor responds again to what the second actor did, and then back and forth in an ever escalating series of efforts to resolve a security dilemma. This is exactly what has happened in the context of NATO and indeed in the context of this entire crisis. We did not expand NATO eastward because the countries of NATO or the United States wanted to do it. In fact, there was a considerable view that it was not in the interest of the original NATO members in 1991 to expand NATO eastward. We did it because the nations of Eastern Europe, freed from the Warsaw Pact, viewed Russia as a threat. And because they viewed Russia as a threat, They wanted the protection of NATO. And we decided that stability and security in that area would be enhanced, not worsened, by those nations coming into NATO. And I'm not going to have time. I'm pretty obvious, but I'll try to go through that NATO. What happened with NATO since 1991? Essentially, two things happened with NATO that caused Russia to perceive it as a threat. First, it expanded eastward. And if you go through NATO's been expanding eastward at quite a considerable pace. Even those, and there were many people who believed that expansion was a mistake, including secretaries of defense and state during the Clinton administration. George Kennan, who was the father of our policy, the containment policy that contained the Soviet Union, considered the expansion, said in 1998 that the expansion of NATO and the Clinton administration's commitment to expand NATO eastward was the greatest mistake made in American foreign policy since the end of World War II. He considered it an act of mental midgets. But it wasn't an act that we undertook for selfish reasons, although Russia views it that way. It was an act we undertook because the nations of Eastern Europe were crying out for it, and we believed that by bringing them into NATO, we would stabilize the security situation in Eastern Europe, not jeopardize it. Mersheimer disagrees. He believes by bringing those nations into NATO, we heightened the security problem in Eastern Europe. Others who opposed it believe that there were other ways to address the security dilemma of those Eastern European nations without bringing them into NATO and creating a line between Western Europe on the one hand and Russia on the other hand, which is where we are now. The next difference between the United States and the Soviet Union is a perception of a great power sphere of influence versus what I'll call the EU rule of law structure. And when professors like Farkas talk about the international order is at risk, what they're really talking about in more realistic terms and less grandiose terms is that the rule of law structure that's being created in the European Union is at risk, and the territorial stability of European boundary lines that's been honored for the last 50 years is at risk. Now, the great power sphere of influence, Russia's view, and the view of most international relations experts up until probably around 1991, was that great powers are expected to have and should respect each other's spheres of influence. So, for example, when the Soviet Union put missiles into Cuba, and we told the Soviets we're going to invade Cuba and we're going to take those missiles out unless you remove them, that invasion would have been a violation of international law. We had no legal right under international law to invade Cuba, but we perceived that we have a sphere of influence in this hemisphere that, I don't want to use the word entitles us, but causes us to justifiably act to protect our security, political, economic, and military in that sphere. That, in one sense, is the foundation of the Monroe Doctrine. We invaded, our proxies invaded Cuba, the Bay of Pigs, because we believed we had a sphere of influence that had been violated by the introduction of communism into Cuba. We attempted to assassinate Castro because we believed that our sphere of influence had been violated. We have intervened in countless South American, Central American nations because we believe that internal developments in those nations threatened our sphere of influence. Russia had a sphere of influence before the collapse in 1991. It wanted it either to continue or to regain it. The view of the United States and the EU was a different view of world relations. And I think it's a view that largely drives out of the EU. The EU was created because the nations of Europe, at least Western Europe, believed that there needed to be a structure that transcended existing nationalities. There needed to be a political structure. It started as an economic structure. There needed to be an economic structure that transcended existing nationalities. There needed to be then a political structure that transcended nationalities in order to allow for the operation of the economic integration that was being created on a transnational basis. And now in the EU, there needs to be, the EU is now talking about the need to create a military structure, a transnational military structure to protect the economic and political structure that's been created on an international basis. But the important point here is that even the great powers of Europe that existed before the end of World War II, Germany in particular, accepted that they would not have spheres of influence with respect to their neighbors, and that they would respect their neighbors' boundaries, and that disputes between them would be resolved by some form of rule of law, which increasingly became the EU. Russia is not a part of that structure. To the extent it wanted to be a part of that structure, we were divided as to whether we wanted them in it. And that's the difference. And the other point on this great power sphere of influence is that Russia says it wants it. We say, hey, Russia, it's a new world. We live by the rule of law now. We don't live by great power spheres of influence anymore. Except the United States, in fact, does. We invaded Iraq in violation of international law because we perceived it to be in our national interest to do so, and we perceived that we had a sphere of influence in the Middle East that required that we do it. And we also perceive, as we are now, that we could fight a war that would create democracy in the Middle East, and that we launched the Iraq War. I never forget this. I was in favor of the Iraq War. To my great embarrassment, I actually had a class at church explaining why the Iraq War that was approaching, hadn't yet started, was the right thing to do. What that'll tell you is you can count on me to be wrong on occasion, at least. But I heard Thomas Friedman just on
It's 8 o'clock.
just on the eve of the launch of the Iraq War being interviewed. He was in support of the Iraq War. And he was asked, do you agree that we need to launch the Iraq War because they're the threat of weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein is developing? And I'll never forget this. It was a Sunday morning, and Friedman said, oh, that is really an overblown argument. Saddam Hussein doesn't really have weapons of mass destruction that are of any material threat to us. That's not why I support the Iraq War. Friedman said, I support the Iraq War because if we change the government in Iraq and put a new government in its place, that new government in Iraq can become an example of democracy and free enterprise in the Middle East that will serve as the foundation of changing the Middle East into something much better. Well, I do agree that democracy and free market economics would largely change the Middle East into something better. But I heard the same thing in the Vietnam War. I do not believe that you can promote democracy at the end of a gun. And I do not believe that every nation has the civilization or cultural foundation to actually support a democracy. And so our visions of recreating the world in our own image, as much as I would agree it would be a better world if we could do that, I think are, if not delusional, as Mersheimer says they are, at least wildly unrealistic or questionable. And now, boy, oh boy, I didn't get even as far as I had hoped to get. Let me see if there's a couple of other things I can touch on. Oh, I should say this. So for the last 22 years, Russia has attempted to exert influence, I wouldn't say control, but substantial dominating influence over the Ukraine with respect to economic integration and Ukrainian foreign policy, particularly with respect to military matters. And it has essentially done that from 1991 until 2014 through political and economic means. It, as I might say, has the EU and the United States also influenced or attempted to influence Ukrainian policy through political and economic means. We have involved ourselves in in Ukrainian politics. Russia has involved itself in Ukrainian politics. Until 2014, I don't believe Russia seriously ever threatened military action to try to exert influence or control over Ukraine. What happened in 2014 was the Euromaidan uprisings. Oh boy, in a nutshell, there was a president of the Ukraine that had been elected in 2010, Yanukovych. Yanukovych was attempting to negotiate in a three-cornered negotiation. He wanted to try to become a part of the EU. The EU, quite frankly, wasn't really that interested in Ukraine becoming a part of the EU up until after the 2014, up until the 2014 events. He was also trying to negotiate economic agreements with Russia. Russia proposed a customs union between Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and a couple of other of the former Russian federations that were now independent states. Russia proposed a customs union that would be sort of like the EU. And at the same time, the Ukrainians were negotiating to become part of the EU. For a lot of reasons, the two concepts were mutually exclusive. You couldn't be part of Russia's customs union if you were going to be part of the EU, and you couldn't be part of the EU if you were going to be part of Russia's customs union, because being part of the EU or the customs unions meant there were no tariffs between you and the other members of your customs union, and there are tariffs between and other barriers to trade between you and people that are outside your customs union. So you can't be both. Russia used economic leverage to try to pressure the Ukraine into joining their customs union instead of the EU. And the leverage that Russia had was that Ukraine was dependent on Russian gas being provided to them at a subsidized price. And Ukraine was bankrupt, and Russia said, we'll pay off your debt. We'll write off the debt or defer the debt that you owe us for subsidized gas that you haven't paid for already. And we will make you a loan or extend you funding to pay off the debt, the $15 billion debt you owe to the IMF. But only if you become part of our customs union and not the EU union. The EU, from its side, wouldn't offer any of that. In fact, what the EU said was, and what the Ukrainian president believed, was that membership in the EU would be in the long term to the advantage of Ukraine, that being part of the EU was a more prosperous future than being part of Russia's customs union. But not only would the EU not really offer any kind of incentives that Russia was offering, but the EU was requiring that before you could become a part of the EU, you've got to reform. And here's an agreement that you can sign. There are various steps to becoming part of the EU. And one of the steps is you got to sign an agreement of how you're going to change your economy, your legal system, your political system, so that they will more align with EU standards. Ukraine, at least the president of Ukraine that was in power in 2014, did not want to do that. Now, the president at that time was Yanukovych. He had been elected in 2010 in an election that everyone agreed was a fair election. He was the legitimately elected president of the Ukraine. Subsequent to his election, he started doing things to try to corrupt the political process in the Ukraine that would give him greater authoritarian power. The other thing that was happening in the Ukraine is that Ukrainian politics, again, up until basically the war, but certainly up until 2014, were divided West versus East. The West, part of the Western civilization, part of Western Christianity, looked to the West, felt themselves more aligned with the West, felt themselves more part of the West. The East of Ukraine, which was actually the more heavily populated area of Ukraine, looked towards Russia, looked towards the Orthodox Church, looked towards Russian civilization as being more aligned with their identity and interests. There are also oligarchs in Ukraine. I wish I could get into how the oligarchs came into being, because I had a role in a very minor role in that and saw it happening. But there were oligarchs in the Ukraine, and the oligarchs in Ukraine were divided. Some were Western-looking oligarchs whose financial economic interest was more aligned with the West, and there were oligarchs in the Ukraine whose financial and economic interests were more aligned with Russia. That was another divide in the Ukraine. So in November of 2013, after a lot of negotiation with the EU, and after building up a significant amount of expectation on the part of the Western Ukrainians that Ukraine was going to join the EU or begin the process of joining the EU, execute an agreement to agree to reform itself, Yanukovych decides, no, we're not, we're going with Russia. Now, some people say he did that because Russia had all the economic leverage and he couldn't afford to do otherwise. Some people said that because he's a corrupt authoritarian, a dictator wannabe, and Russia would protect him and preserve his power. Whatever, he made that choice. Riots started in Kiev. Initially, those riots were largely directed at this issue. They weren't attempting to throw Yanukovych out of power. But they ultimately, the political confrontation escalated in Ukraine because Yanukovych, with the encouragement of Russia, used force, police force, but force nonetheless, to try to suppress this uprising. That caused the people that were uprising to become angry at the force that was being used. Dozens of people, and at one point I think hundreds of people, were killed when the riots were suppressed, to insist that Yanukovych leave office. Actually, a resolution of the crisis was negotiated with substantial concessions being made to the Western protesters. Yanukovych made a lot of major concessions to them. It was a negotiated resolution of the crisis that was supported and mediated by Eastern European powers. It was agreed to by Yanukovych and the political parties in Ukraine that supported Yanukovych, the political parties in Ukraine that supported the Western-oriented point of view, and by the governing body of the protest movement. The protest movement actually had a governing body. They all agreed to a resolution. It did not include Yanukovych leaving office. The agreement was brought to the square where the rioters had occupied, and the protesters were asked, here's the agreement we've worked out. And the protesters rebelled against the agreement. An important but small, but nonetheless important part of the protest movement is a neo-fascist right-wing group that's been in Ukraine since the Germans invaded Ukraine in World War II. And that group, a very small part of this protest movement, but was a disproportionately influential part because they were prepared to suffer violence and commit violence. And the non-neo-fascist parts of the movement, which vastly predominated the movement, tolerated them, in fact, actually used them in a way. That opposition from those groups, they said they were going to overrun the government buildings in Kiev. They were going to kill Yanukovych. Yanukovych fled. Russia perceived at that point that the United States was behind that. And indeed, to a certain extent, we were. Our Secretary of Affairs for European Affairs went to the Maidan Square, or Maidan, Independence Square. Maidan is the Ukrainian word for square. And in support of the protesters. John McCain went there in support of the protesters. Chris Murphy, Democratic senator from Connecticut, went to the square in support of the protesters. And in a transcript of a telephone call between Victoria Nuland, who is one of Putin's most vehement critics, there is a transcript of a phone call between her and our ambassador in Ukraine, where they are discussing who the United States wants to become the president of the new government that's going to take the place of the one that's just been overthrown. And they talk about how they're going to attempt to bring that about. Russians, I guess, intercepted that communication and then publicized it. So the Russians believe that to a certain extent, we were behind what they viewed as a coup of a democratically elected government. The Russians realized at that point that they were losing the battle of economic leverage. They were losing the political battle, and that's when they turned to military force. And I guess I better stop here.
I think that's a cliffhanger, Dave. Yeah, I think, I know you could go on for quite a bit longer, and the information is captivating and something that basically none of us have or have taken the time to have access to. So I want to thank you for the depth and breadth of what you've shared. If you'd like to stop sharing your screen, we could get a gallery view of everybody, which would be good. Wonderful, thank you. As a consequence of everything we learned last week and of all the material to be presented this week, and Dave's stated goal of having some dialogue among the participants on the topic, we have set a Let's Talk About It next week as our Thursday evening program. And I think given where we are, what we might do is allot the first 15 minutes or so to Dave with a bell to go off, where he might hit the remaining key points that he wants to make. And then he will pose a series of discussion questions for us to engage with. Certainly, we're looking to bring in other perspectives. There has been a great deal in the news lately, a lot of podcasts, a lot of programs with different experts weighing in on both the causes and current circumstance of the conflict, and also to focus some attention on what we perceive to be the risks and the potential outcomes of the conflict as it's evolving. So that will be our focus for the program next week. And we hope that you will join us then. Now, tonight's program will be recorded, as was last week. So for anyone who has missed one or the other or both, there's an opportunity to catch up with the incredible information that Dave has provided us in preparation for dialogue next week.
And thanks everybody. I'm sorry to go on, but and talk so much, but there's just a lot of information to share. And as I said at the end of the last meeting, I would really love for someone who disagrees with me to take up the cudgel of arguing the points, because I think in that dialogue, it will help. It'll help us think about things.
Absolutely. And having opposing, there's no magic. There's not even any necessarily magic to the history, because there's a breadth of history and an interpretation of history that can vary from perspective to perspective. And certainly there are other points of view. So do a little research between now and next Thursday, and we'll look forward to seeing you then and seeing how the conversation evolves. Thank you so much, Dave, for putting all of this together. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Okay.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you,
Thanks.
Sue.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Dave.